Hello, my name is Declan Zupo. I'm a junior studying political science and environmental studies at the University of Oregon. I'm very excited to share with you today my work in progress research that I've completed as a part of the Summer Undergraduate Research Fellowship. Uh, Before I get started, I want to first thank my advisor, Dr. Emily Eliza Scott from Environmental Studies, for her help throughout this process. And of course, I also want to thank everyone from the Center for Undergraduate Research. The working title for my article is The Public University in Its Space, a case study of the University of Oregon. Before I get started, I first just want to lay out a bit of a roadmap of what I'm going to talk about today. My work is still in progress, and so I'll largely stick to my literature review and talking about the case studies I'm working on now. I'll start with my guiding questions and talk about how I've arrived at them, and then move on to talking a bit about space and why I wanted to focus on that for my work. And then I'll talk about the methods that I'm using for this research, a little bit of context, and that should lead succinctly into my literature review, where I can talk briefly about kind of the erosion of the public university and the threats of market fundamentalist ideology to public pedagogy. I'll then move to my case studies, which is where I'm at in my research process now, and talk about my next steps. So the two questions that I'm seeking to answer through this work are first, has the neoliberal capture of American higher education become physically entrenched in the public university space? And second, can this transition then be seen in the evolution of University of Oregon's campus? The first question attacks the system level, looking at how the state divestment across the board in the American system of higher education, particularly public higher education, has changed the process of higher education, the ethos, and the experience of the student. Um, this argument has been made consistently over the years, especially since the post-Cold War era, where we saw huge cuts in funding to public educations and the transition of public education from a public good to a private commodity. The question I'm seeking to ask is, has this neoliberal market fundamentalist ideology become reified in these institutions in their very space? And then in order to answer that question, I then transitioned to looking at specifically the evolution of University of Oregon's campus through a series of case studies. So first, to briefly touch on why I want to look at space. The space of the public university is not just a space of education, it is a public forum, and has been argued to be so in a significant body of literature. However, over the past few years following the pandemic, we've seen more and more emphasis on the idea of space-based learning and understanding the importance of the space of education and not just the process. My argument hopes to, I seek to align this kind of divestment and increased reliance on private actors with the expansion of public universities as university is increasingly seen as a credential necessary for operating in the marketplace, and asking if this public space, one of our last bastions of public forum, has become eroded by private interests. And obviously, there's also, of course, the argument that the university acts as a microcosm for society as a whole, for the inequalities that we see, as it does tend to replicate those. And I'm hoping to conclude by looking at the ways in which the erosion of the public institution of the American university is a reflection of the larger erosion of our liberal institutions as a whole and these liberal spaces. The methods that I've been using in this process thus far have largely been descriptive and interpretive throughout my process of literature review, hoping to align an existing canon of literature about the system of American education as a whole with the transition of the University of Oregon towards a more private model. And that has entailed a lot of archival research, looking at planning documents stretching back to the 70s to understand the participatory nature of our university planning. And then I'm then aligning this qualitative review of existing literature, looking at the evolution of the neoliberal university and the process of state divestments and this effect on the student as consumer with the evolution of the university campus, while paying special attention to the way that the campus operates on the student. And then, of course, the case studies will entail a comparative analysis between current planning processes and the university's espoused goals for planning, looking at funding and the ways in which the proliferation of private interests into the university system and university planning has affected the way in which we disproportionately stagger funds to certain projects while allowing buildings such as those that house our humanities departments to continue to be dilapidated. Um, so briefly, as I mentioned, my research so far has largely taken the space of a literature review, looking at the evolution of the American system of higher education and ideology associated with it, whether that be the American system of higher education becoming sort of this public good during its gilded age between, or golden age, as some say, between the Cold War era and, or sorry, between the New Deal era and the Cold War era, when we saw huge federal funding for higher education in defense of American interests. First, in pursuit with the GI Bill of allowing this our returning service people to receive an education and vocational degrees in order to operate in the marketplace. And then following Sputnik and our competitiveness with um, the Soviet powers during the Cold War, this investment in scientific degrees. As I argue in my work, investment in education has never been outright for the goal of social welfare, but more for global competitiveness. And this neoliberal transition that we see in the era of globalization transitions this sort of federally powered means of holding global competitiveness and competing in the knowledge economy to a consumerist angle. So as opposed to public education being a social welfare, it becomes a private commodity that us as citizens who operate in the marketplace should seek out of our own accord. And this is sort of that ideology, the transition of these liberal institutions towards a more market fundamentalist ideology. And that transition took the form, as we see in the case of the University of Oregon, uh, partnerships with corporate actors and an increased reliance on tuition. As argued in the University of Nike by Joshua Hunt, University of Oregon was not just a example of the corporate capture of higher education, but a model, particularly with our sports programs, as Joshua Hunt looks at. It acted as a model for other institutions who then took similar stances of cutting budgets and replacing state subsidy with private dollars. Um, we see this with Measure 5, a bill which effectively slashed funding for our university and higher education across the board. However, currently, University of Oregon still has the lowest funding out of all higher institutions of higher education or universities in Oregon. And this has led to our increased reliance on private interests. Interestingly, the managerial style of governance, which has come into effect across the board in higher education and is linked to this sort of market fundamentalist ideology, the idea of having a series of trustees managing the university as a firm as opposed to a public institution, which would be elected democratically. These same actors who lobbied for state divestment in the system of higher education also came to lobby for this sort of managerial style of trustees. It's also important to mention, going back just a slide, that apologies, that the trustee model has actually been analyzed and written about by students at our own university. Andrew Lubach wrote a really informative thesis that I've been incorporating into my work, looking at how business lobbies forced the university's hand and how vehemently the trustee model was opposed by students at our university. So where my literature review seeks to first contextualize this transition towards privatization and state divestment, and a more market fundamentalist idea or outlook towards the process of education. My case studies, which follow, are going to try to align this archival process that I've set out to contextualize the university's transition with the evolution of its space, asking the question if the University of Oregon has become privatized or has adopted these market fundamentalist ideas, or been forced to, then can that same ideology be reflected in the very space of the university? The spaces that I'm looking at in order to answer this question are first the Jacqua Center. The Jacqua Center is an athletic building on campus which has resources which are only accessible to student athletes who further the brand of the university. Second, I'm going to look at the Matthew Knight Arena, a gift from Phil Knight, one of the university's biggest donor, that all was supposedly fully funded by the sports program because our sports program is separate from the university's general funds, but actually ended up taking money from the general fund, as I'll argue. Um, and then I'm going to look at the Knight Center for Scientific Impact, a project which is ongoing, expansion towards the Willamette River from our university, a project which overtook student spaces that has existed since the 70s and has seen significant student backlash against. Also, a space which is largely used for the furthering of productive research, specifically in the scientific fields, and a space that students truly have very limited access to, except a very select few. And then finally, although I'm still parsing this part out, I'm interested in looking at the way in which the university has began to take over parts of Eugene as a city in its expansionary nature in order to increasingly bring in students who will be paying tuition. The university is forced to create more and more housing, and this housing then pushes out small businesses and buys out small businesses and homeowners around the university in order to continue to grow and have more tuition-paying students. I'm, as you can tell, not entirely finished with this part of my research, and I'm still looking into the planning policy and process for things like the new apartments near the Duck Store and the East Campus Development Plan, a plan which also, similar to the Knight Center for Scientific Impact, seeks to knock out existing community spaces, student-led spaces, with new building projects. So I suppose my point with these case studies, or my goal, is to use these unit level analyses of spaces at the University of Oregon in order to understand my original question, which is if the American university has become this neoliberal institution, then can we see it reflected in the space of the university? So I suppose with respect to next steps, I'm hoping to present my finished work at the Undergraduate Research Symposium in the spring. And I'm also finishing an article now. I've written my literature review, and as I mentioned, I'm working on these case studies. And my goal is to then publish them in RJ in the end of winter term. Thank you so much for your time. And again, a huge thank you to Emily Scott and everyone from the Department of Undergraduate Research and Distinguished Scholarships.